What I'm going to talk to you today about, as Jim said, is the end of the war, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and then, of course, the surrender of Japan. It was a long, drawn-out war, and by the time that surrender, I think most Americans were very glad to see the end of the war. Most all the mothers in this country were very glad to see that. These are the players. All right, and well, I say that if you ever go to a ball game, they always give you a program. Well, I want to talk a little bit, very briefly, about these. I'm going to talk to them more as I'm going through my lecture. Of course, everyone knows who FDR is, the president at that time. But the significance of FDR and what we're talking about today is that the two guys right below him, Leo Szilard and Einstein, they were the top physicists in the world. In fact, Einstein, probably the most famous physicist that ever lived. And if you'd ask anybody to name a physicist today, they'd probably say Albert Einstein. He's been dead for 70 years. So the story is that Leo Szilard was a Hungarian Jew who worked at the University of Berlin. And when the Nazis took over, obviously he escaped. He left the country. He is credited with, in 1936, he received the patent for the breakdown of fusion and how it would work in a nuclear reaction. Now, he didn't do it, but he wrote the paper on it, and he was given, he was pretty much the father of it, if you will. He saw basically how dangerous it was if the Nazis got their hands on an atomic weapon. He had lived there and he knew the danger. So he approached Einstein and he said, look, we need to do something. We need to do something now. And he wrote this big long letter about explaining how dangerous the situation was in Germany right now with Hitler and the Nazis coming to power. And so when he did that, he talked about a guy named Kyle Heinsberger, who was now the head of the atomic program in Germany. And he was a very capable scientist. He wrote the book on quantum mechanics. And so Szilard, he wrote this letter, and Einstein signed it. And he sent it to FDR. And Einstein had so much pull that FDR acted upon it almost immediately, and they started what became known as the Manhattan Project. He put General Groves in charge of the logistics. Groves was the general who built the Pentagon. So he had a way of getting things done. He didn't like to hear the word no. He was a great big man, very gruff, very hard to get along with. He was used to getting his way. But in this circumstance, he was probably the perfect person to oversee the Manhattan Project. He's the one that built the community at Los Alamos. Oppenheimer, how many have seen the movie, Oppenheimer? Most all of you, yeah. Oppenheimer was the head physicist, so they recruited Oppenheimer to recruit the rest of the physicists to develop this weapon. Now, while they were there, you will never hear any time that they would ever use the word bomb or atomic. It was always referred to as the gadget. And this was for security measures. It was never referred to as a bomb, ever. It was the gadget. Oppenheimer recruited the best minds that he could find. There were a total of around 2,000 scientists, but there was about 250 that actually worked on this project at Los Alamos. And they were some of the brightest minds in the world, actually. So after that, we've got Colonel Tibbets. Tibbets was the one that flew the Enola Gay, named after his mother, the B-29 that actually dropped the first atomic bomb. And Major Sweeney was the one that flew Boxcar, which dropped the second atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Truman, president, who ordered the bombs to be dropped, which you're well aware of him. And the last one there is Stimson. I'm going to talk more about him in just a second. He was the Secretary of War. On the Japanese side, you have basically three main characters, if you will. Of course, the Emperor, Hirohito. And then you had a General, Anami. Anami was head of the army. Okay, he probably had more power than anybody in the country, except for the emperor. And he was a warrior. Okay, that's the best way. He lived by the code of the Bushido, the warrior, the samurai. And then, of course, the Togo, who was the foreign minister. All right, these two right here were the most instrumental in both the dropping of the bomb, or at least Stinson, and then the surrender. These were the two people that had more to do with the surrender of the Japan than anybody else. Stimson there, how many are familiar with him? Anybody? A few of you. And that's kind of strange, really, because he was a major player throughout the early and the mid 19th or 20th century. He graduated from Yale, he was a member of the Skull and Bones Secret Society. He went on to Harvard, graduated from Harvard Law, and went to work on Wall Street. He became extremely famous as one of the best lawyers on Wall Street because he would only take cases that he would never represent anybody that he thought was corrupt. He only took cases in which he thought there had been some wrongdoing. So he became very popular. He was very much in demand, and he was very well rewarded. He became extremely wealthy. He and his wife, Mabel, bought a place in upstate New York, to tell you his wealth, that they paid about $800,000 for. Now, that doesn't sound like that much, but in today's money, that would be $13 to $14 million. That's how much money he accrued working on Wall Street. He was the top catch on Wall Street, and it didn't take long for the government to figure out that this guy had a little something more going for him than just being a lawyer. So Taft brought him into his administration. He worked for Taft until he went out of office as a Secretary of State. And then for a short period of time, he tried to run for governor of New York, but was defeated. And then he took a job as the governor of the Philippines. He came back home after that and went back to Wall Street. Then Harding brought him into his administration as the Secretary of State. Now, obviously, being a Wall Street lawyer, he was a true blue Republican, all right? But FDR, and he was very well thought of, and across the aisle. And so when the FDR came to power about 1940, when the war was imminent, he called upon Stimson to come back into his cabinet and be the Secretary of War. The plus on that was that Stimson was really close friends with Marshall, General Marshall, who was head of all the armed forces. And their office was in the Pentagon. And they were side by side, and they never closed the door between their offices. Now, that was a great thing for the United States, is because you have the Secretary of War and you had the United States, the head of the armed forces. They communicated continuously. They were on the same page. And so that was a very big benefit. So he worked out of the Pentagon. He was a very religious man, very righteous. And he had no kids because he'd had mumps when he was an adult. And so he was very close to Mabel, and he confided in her quite a bit. And they made a great pair. But what he did was, and it's hard to believe, as religious and as strict as he was actually an advocate for the development of the atomic bomb. All right? And I'll come back to that in just a second. Over here you have Togo. Togo was very similar in his characteristics as Simpson. He was a reserved, quiet guy, very intellectual. He went to work for the government. He faced a little bit of opposition because hundreds of years before, his family had actually migrated or immigrated from Korea. And in that time, in that period of Japanese history, they were looked down upon, anybody with a Korean ancestry. So his 4 great-grandpas before or something changed his name from Parks to Togo. But there was still some resentments towards him in the higher echelons. But he overcame this. He worked in the embassy in Berlin. He met a German gal whose husband had passed away that had 3 little boys. He married her, brought her back to Japan. They had a child, a little girl. And he never liked the Nazis. He thought they were thugs, all right? He thought they were uncouth and unrefined, and he had very little good to say about them. But he had to work with them. So he was in charge. Well, coming into the late 30s, he was not an advocate for the war against the United States. In fact, he spoke against it. Now, that was a very, very dangerous thing to do. All right, from 1920 to 1945, there were over 300 political assassinations in Japan in the name of the emperor. If you said anything against the war or anything against the military governors, you would be subject to assassination. Yamamoto, if you don't know who that is, he was the best military mind the Japanese had. He was an admiral. In 1939, he spoke out against the war with the United States because he had been military attaché to Washington. He understood the United States power. They had to send him out to sea because there was a plot to assassinate him. And so it was a very traumatic time for people who spoke out against the government. So he didn't blatantly come out and say we shouldn't fight him, but he made it known that he did not support the war effort. So consequently, when Pearl Harbor happened, and against his wishes, he resigned. And he went to live with his wife and his kids, kind of in the foothills of the mountains. And he studied, and what he studied was the downfall of modern society during war. I thought that was kind of appropriate. The war went badly for the Japanese, and in 1944, after Tojo was relieved as the prime minister, he was brought back in by Suzuki, the new prime minister. That was a very, very smart move. Japan at this time was run by an oligarchy, all right? It was called the Supreme Council, or in later terms, the Big Six, okay? And so he had to deal, and he was one of the Big Six, he had to deal with this council, and basically they ran the country. They ran the war. They were the government, all right? And that's where he worked with and who he worked for. And so what I want to talk about, and I'll come back to these two guys when we get to the surrender, but I want to talk about the development of the bomb and the bomb first and how we used it, and then I'll bring these two back into play. Okay, I'll tie it all in. So in 1936, after the theory of nuclear fission was put forth, then they started developing, they started getting the idea that this is something to be done. There was a scientist from Italy named Fermi, who worked at the University of Chicago, and he created the first chain reaction in the football stadium at the University of Chicago in December of 1942. This proved it could be done. He bombarded elements with neutrons and had a sustained reaction. All right, so from that point on, the nuclear age was born, all right, so to speak. There was a lot of headaches, a lot of work to be done, but it was proved that it could be done. So what they did at Los Alamos, they had to figure out how they could get a controlled explosion. Now, it's a little easier for me to say than it was to do, but they come up with two methods. One would be a uranium bomb, which was element uranium-235. All right, 235 is the atomic number, the number of protons. And then they come up with a plutonium bomb, which the number was 239. Okay, these were two different ways of setting off a nuclear reaction. Basically, long story short, what they did when it came to the uranium mine, what they did, they made a way that they shot a pellet into a core, which created critical mass and started a chain reaction. This bomb became known as Little Boy. And that they had a solid core and a hollow core, and at 900 feet per second, which is a tremendous velocity, it would combine, and that would start to reach critical mass and start the chain reaction. That's how Little Boy worked, all right? The other bomb, the plutonium bomb, worked on a concussion. In other words, what happened was the core would be here and they would explode, and all this pressure would come in at the same time, and again you would achieve the reaction. Those were the two methods to set off the atomic bomb. The plutonium was more powerful, but it took a lot more to develop than the uranium bomb did. So on July the 16th, in 1945, at a place out in the highlands of New Mexico, a place called Trinity, they set the first nuclear explosion off after about 3 years of round-the-clock work, and it was plutonium-based. That's when Oppenheimer made his famous statement, "I have become the Emperor of Death, the destroyer of worlds," whatever. And so from that point on, they knew that it worked. At that time, Truman was in Potsdam, and he was there for the Potsdam Conference. where they were meeting with Churchill and Stalin to decide how to divide up Europe after the war. And they came up with the Potsdam Decree, which said that the only way they would accept surrender for Japanese is if it was unconditional. That becomes a very, very big sticking point. Unconditional surrender. Now, that was in mid-July to August 1st, okay? And so we knew the bomb would work. We knew that we had to demand on the Japanese that they had to have unconditional surrender, but yet we heard nothing. Now, I'll tell you what the Japanese were doing behind the scene in just a second. But because we heard nothing, Truman gave the order to General LeMay out in the South Pacific. He says, after August 1st, if we've heard nothing, you proceed forward with the atomic bomb, the dropping of the bomb. So nothing happened up to August 1st. So on August 6th, early morning hours, the Enola Gay was parked over a pit, and Thin Man was hoisted up into its bomb bay. All right. This particular bomb, this was the uranium bomb. It couldn't have gone any better. This whole deal. It worked flawlessly. They took off. He used the whole runway, which had caused quite a bit of consternation to the people in the tower because they weren't sure he was going to take off. But he took off, but the bomb was not armed because they were afraid that if they had armed it before and it crashed, it would have destroyed the island of Tenia. So what they did was, after they got airborne for a couple hours, one of the technicians went back, took the cover off of it, and pulled the plugs and armed the bomb. And so now it was a fully armed nuclear weapon. They got near Iwo Jima, right here. There they met up with two other B-29s. One of them was called the Big Artisan, and the other one was called Necessary Evil. The Artisan was to measure the strength of the blast. Necessary Evil was to take photographs. They met up there, and then they flew to their primary target, which was Hiroshima. Now, before this had taken place, LeMay had sent a strike list to Pentagon and to Stinson of what he wanted to bomb. On his list, the top priority on his list was Kyoto. All right, that was the Japanese ancient capital. It was the cultural center. And very quickly, Stinson said, no, there's no way we're bombing that. It has no military value. He wanted to bomb it because it had so much ceremonial value. That was nixed immediately. Stinson had actually been to Kyoto on his honeymoon. So he had a lot of feelings for the town. And so they sent in several others, Hiroshima being one, Nagasaki, Kokura, and a few other towns, all right? And so it was decided on the first one that the primary would be Hiroshima. Now, both Truman and Stinson had agreed that it had to be a military target. They weren't going to just bomb civilians, although they knew they'd be civilian casualties, but it had to be a military target. So what they did when they decided on Hiroshima, the second division, or our Japanese Army division, was located there. So it did have a military, target in mind. And they flew. It was a perfect day, weather-wise. As they approached, they had a rule that they could only bomb if they had total visibility. You could not bomb if you couldn't see the target. There was no. They could bomb by radar, but they were prohibited from doing so. As they approached, Hiroshima came into view. Their aiming target was a bridge and right in the middle of downtown. At 31,000 feet, they released the bomb. At 600 meters, it detonated, and the first nuclear explosion over a civilian population took place. Instantaneously, 70,000 people were killed. Now, you think next time you turn on a football game, like an NFL game, and you see a stadium completely packed with people, that's about 70,000. In less than a second, all those people would be dead. All right, now that's the devastation of that bomb. In the next year, another 140,000 people died of radiation poisoning, something we did not understand at that stage of the game. So it was quite devastating. They flew home. It was a flawless mission, all right? Again, Truman puts out a call to the Japanese Supreme Council, unconditional surrender. hears nothing back from them. Okay. So on their own, LeMay, now he wasn't like he went against orders, because Truman had said that, you know, when you're ready, you can send off the next bomb. But Truman had no idea the bombing of Nagasaki was getting ready to take place. They didn't inform the president. They just did it and so first he heard about it, Nagasaki had been bombed. This did not make him very happy. In fact, he sent out a communique very quickly that there would be no more bombs set off unless he gave specific orders to do so. All right. But now this was, as good as that first one went, this second one was perilous. The plane that was carrying the second was called Boxcar. These were specially modified B-29s. They were known as silver plates, and they'd been modified to hold one bomb. Now this was going to hold Fat Man. So they pulled over that same trench. They put Fat Man up there into the plane, and when doing the pre-check, Sweeney determined that the valve on the back fuel tank would not work. All right, so he goes to Tibbets. Tibbets was the head of the 509th Bomb Group, and he says, "Look, I can't access that 600 gallons of fuel in the back of the plane." He said, "I don't think that's a problem. You've got 7,000 gallons." He says, "Now you've got 6,400 gallons." So that should be more than enough. I said, "That's, you know," and besides, he says, "That's usually used, that's more for ballast than anything else." So Tibbets gave him the go-ahead. So they took off, same thing, the bomb wasn't armed. They took off, and just about 2 hours into the flight from Tinia, going up this direction, all of a sudden they're sitting there and the bomb arms itself. These red lights start going off, blinking like this. The bomb had armed itself. That means you're 45 seconds away from being nothing more than a vapor. So the engineer yanked the cover off of it, and inexplicably, the engineers on the ground had set the switches in the wrong position. And so when it hit a certain barometric pressure, it armed itself. And so, I mean, they were seconds away from being nothing left of them. The engineer, he put the switches back into position that they should have been in and disarmed the bomb, and literally was seconds to spare. Now, how'd you like to been on that plane? You're sitting there watching these lights go off, and you got an atomic bomb sitting next to you. It wouldn't be sitting next to you for long, okay? So that's the first mishap. Well, the second, actually, because the valve wasn't working. So they go on, and they get up here to a rendezvous point, again, near Iwo Jima, and they're supposed to meet up with two other B-29s. Same procedure. The Big Artisan was the first one, but the second was called the Big Stink. Big Stink didn't show up. So they wait, and they're circling, and they're circling. They're waiting on the Big Stink. The Big Stink got lost. Never did make it. So he circled for an hour, waiting on this other B-29 to show up. Now, gas is starting to, the fuel's starting to be something to be concerned about. So after an hour, he makes the decision. He says, "We can wait no longer. We're proceeding on." They're going to fly up to Kokura. This is Kokura right here. So they take the path up to Kokura. When they get there, the weather's supposed to be good, and the weather was. But the problem was, days preceding this raid, LeMay had bombed cities in that area, firebombed them. And the smoke from all that destruction had billowed up, and black clouds of smoke had overtaken the city, and you couldn't see it. And they had strict orders not to bomb without being able to see. So he made a run on Kokura, and the bombardier looking through couldn't see it. So he said, "Well, we'll go around." So he spun around. He comes back around. He makes a second run. Again, they can't see anything other than the smoke. Now fuel is starting to be real critical. But he says, "I've got a nuclear device here. What am I going to do with it? I can't fly back to Tinia." So he makes another run. He circles around again. And on the third time, the radio man picks up chatter that the Japanese are scrambling zeros, because, this one bomber's been circling our city for about an hour. They're tired of it. So he has to make a decision. He's got a live atomic weapon. He can't drop it on Kokura because he can't see anything. He's got 0 fighters taken off, so he's got to get out of there. So he and his co-pilot talk over for just about a minute, and then they decide to head to Nagasaki. There's an expression in Japan. It's called Kokura luck. All right? Like we say, the luck of the Irish. In Japan, they'll talk about kakura luck. You know, that's how lucky you are. You're kakura lucky. You see what I mean? And so from here down to there is only about 35-minute flight. It's not long, all right? And as they approach, earlier in the day, reconnaissance had said that Nagasaki was clear. But as they approached, the clouds had set in. And as they approached, they could not see Nagasaki. Now, fuel has become critical, all right? So he has to make a decision. What am I going to do? So he decides, well, we're going to make a run on it just to see. And the bombardier's looking through it, and he can't see anything. And literally at the last second, an opening appears in the clouds, and the bombardier can see Nagasaki. He immediately drops the bomb, and he yells, "Bombs away!" And then he goes back and goes, "Wait a minute, bomb away!" And so when that happens, what you do, you bank away and get out of there as fast as you can, because there's a shock wave that's going to hit you. When this happened to the Enola Gay, the only person that actually saw the bomb explosion and the aftermath was the tail gunner, because they were heading out of there. Nimitz called back to the tail gunner and said, "Describe it to me." And he says, "It is a huge mushroom cloud that's rising rapidly." And he says, "It's purple and red lightning in the middle of it." And then he paused for a minute and he says, "You know, I think they've opened up the gates of hell, and I just looked in." That's how he described the bomb at Hiroshima. Well, it was the same thing at Nagasaki. It didn't have quite the devastating effect because Hiroshima's in a flat plain, so that shock wave went out like this and just destroyed everything. Nagasaki's more in kind of like a bowl, okay? So after it went off, the shock wave was diverted a little bit. It still killed 60,000 people instantly, not 70,000 if you want to get split the hairs there. But it was a more powerful bomb, but did just slightly less damage. It ended up being dropped 2 miles off of the IP where it was supposed to be dropped, and it was dropped right above the Mitsubishi plant where they made the Lance torpedoes. So it did, I mean, again, it was a military target. Wiped it out. But now he's heading for home, and so he radios Tenia. He says, "Well, the drop was successful, but I can't make it home." All right. So everybody in Tenia thinks he's going to crash into the ocean. I mean, they're all stewing around. What are we going to do here? He's not going to get back. So he makes a course to Okinawa. As they come in, they see Okinawa in the distance, and so they're all kind of thinking they're going to make it here. And as they start in on their approach, one of the engines sputters and stops. Fuel starvation. But you still had 3 engines. As you come in, just as his wheels got near the runway, the second engine sputtered and stopped. 2 engines. He got the plane down successfully, and as he taxied, the third engine sputtered and stopped. So when they got it over to the hangar and the grounds crew came out, and I've read 2 accounts of this, one of them said that he had 35 gallons of gas left. The other one said he had 7 gallons. Started out with 7,000, and he got in there with 7 gallons of fuel. Now that's how close he came to disaster. Had that happened 2 to 3 minutes earlier, that weight of that plane, there's no way you're going to get in there on 1 or 2 engines. You were going to go into the sea, all right, or something worse, okay? So the whole thing was fraught with basically upheaval, and they were very fortunate they did drop the bomb. They filled it up. A couple hours later, they made their way back to Tenia with no more disruptions, if you will. All right, but now Truman, he sends another notice through Stimson, through the embassies in Switzerland that, you know, we're going to wipe out your cities. You know, you better surrender, because it's kind of an ultimatum. All right, so that's how the bonds were delivered. Now I'll talk about how the surrender came about. It's pretty interesting. Togo had a meeting. He'd requested a meeting with the emperor on June the 20th, long before the first atomic bomb, June the 20th. And in that meeting, he explained the situation, what was going on. Now, the emperor was kind of kept in the dark a little bit about just how grave the situation was. But he was explaining the situation that basically they had no chance. You know, the Americans and the Allies were going to land on their shores, and there wasn't anything they're going to do about it, and it's going to be a bloodbath. We're going to lose all this and that. So the emperor, he tells Togo, he says, "I want this war brought to an end as quickly as possible." Now, this is the emperor speaking, all right? So now Togo goes back, and the big six there. These are the guys that ran the country right here. This is the all-power bunch right here. They want no part of it. Go to the Bushido. Go to the war. We will never surrender. Never. All right. The three I've highlighted over here, they were a little more moderate. They understood. These were the warriors. Absolutely not. Him being the main one. There's no way. So Togo, in private, meets with Anami. Now, this is going to be hard for you to understand. It's hard for me to understand, and I've studied it. There is an expression. It does not translate well. When it translates as talking from your stomach. Now, that's how it translates, talking from your stomach. And what that means is that they were masters of this, the politicians were masters at talking in innuendos. So that the person listening, you had to figure out for yourself what they're really talking about. Did they mean this or did they mean that? And that's the way these business was conducted, because you just couldn't come out and say, hey, we're going to surrender, or we're talking about surrender. Someone would assassinate you. Those junior officers would have taken you out of the picture at this stage of the game. And so in private, Anami, Togo got the impression that he was receptive, all right, to the idea of a surrender. So when they met in a dungeon, and that's the best way I can put it, an underground bunker in Tokyo, no air conditioner, it's August, high humidity, the walls are wet, smoke everywhere from the cigarette smoke, you could hardly breathe, and they were in there for hours arguing. They finally come up with what we call the 4 conditions. And the first and foremost was that the emperor stays on the throne. Second of all, there'd be no occupation of the country. Third, that they disarm themselves. And fourth, they'd be in charge of their own war tribunes. In other words, war crimes. Well, Togo knew the Americans are never going to buy this. Well, there's no way the United States is going to not accept these terms. So the wrangling goes on. So they break, and Togo talks to the emperor again. The emperor says, I want this to end, but not to this group. He's telling Togo this. Togo sends a message to the ambassador in Moscow and says, look, I want you to go to Molotov, the foreign minister of Russia. And I said, I want you to present him with the idea that we will surrender if the emperor can stay on the throne. That's called the 1 condition, not the 4 condition, the 1 condition. When the ambassador goes to Molotov, Molotov totally rebuts him. He says, look, we're not doing any of this. Tomorrow, we're declaring war on you. Like that. And so they're flabbergasted. And they did. The next day, Russia declared war on Japan. And then they attacked their troops in Manchuria. So now Togo's really faced with a dilemma. He's got the Russians now involved. He was hoping them to be mediators. Now they're attacking in Manchuria. He's got the emperor wanting to end the war, and he's got this council here that are wanting to fight to the death. Now, I'll tell you how drastic this was. And I get asked this a lot, when I do lectures like this. Do you think, and usually it's from college students, not people your age, college students. Well, should we have not have dropped that bomb? Well, my answer to that is, it's not yes, it's hell yes, we should have dropped that bomb. All right, now I'm going to tell you why. The Japanese had 7,000 kamikazes ready to go. They reserved 7,000 planes. They would have hit every ship we put into those ports. At recess and in kindergarten up through high school age, they were teaching kids not to play on the playground, but to take bamboo sticks, sharpen them, and when American soldiers approached them, they were teaching them how to impale the American soldiers, because they said Americans will never shoot a young kid, a little boy or a little girl. And so they were teaching them this. We literally, and I'm not kidding you, we literally would have had to destroy that country. And the estimates were that we would lose 1 million casualties. All right, we just came out of Iwo Jima. Now, a few people have studied Iwo Jima. We had 24,000 casualties on Iwo Jima. 6,000 of them were deaths. On Okinawa it was even worse. We had 43,000 casualties and 12,500 were killed. Now, this is back to back. And we haven't even got to Japan yet, all right? So The Japanese were trying to basically, in their terms, they were trying to bleed us dry. They were trying to make it so horrendous that we would somehow sue for peace. That was their strategy. They knew they couldn't win, but it would be so bloody that they would basically come out with some face. All right. Well, again, Stinson goes to Truman and he said, look, he said, Togo, through an emissary, he said that, they'd be willing. He thinks he could sell them on the idea if the emperor stays on the throne. At first, Truman says, there's no way. He says, everybody in this country wants him to be hung in the square. He says, I don't hang him in the square. They're going to hang me in the square, like that. But he said, no. He said, and basically he went back through this appalling numbers that were it. He said they were afraid America was going to lose its, it just didn't want to fight anymore. The mothers of this country were going to stand up and said enough is enough. All right, and they were definitely worried about that. So Truman, after mulling it over a little bit, he agrees. He says, all right. He says, if they will capitulate, we'll leave the emperor on the throne with a condition. And the condition is that we being the Americans, rule the country. Now the emperor can stay on the throne, but we're going to rule the country. So through the embassies in Spain or in Switzerland, long story short, they get it back to Togo. Togo then meets with this council. This council's they're in session on August the 9th when somebody busts in and says they just bombed Nagasaki, just while they're meeting. And so now this changed the dynamics, all right? And so they're mulling around. These guys were still, he was making this big grand play. We're going to fight till the last person. We'll never surrender. He was making this big coat of the Bushido play, if you will, which had Togo up in arms. Emperor shows up. Emperor comes in. He says, this war is ending. I don't care if I stay on the throne or not. Enough is enough. We're losing too many people. We're losing enough is enough. Well, they first started to kind of back up a little bit and start, kind of protested, and the emperor said no. He said, this is the way it's going to be. Now, the emperor was still the emperor. Okay, he was a god, if you will. And so they relinquished. All right, so through the diplomacy, through the Swedish embassy, or not Swedish, but the Switzerland embassy, they sent word that they would accept these terms. As long as the emperor, they would surrender as long as the emperor stayed on the throne. So the emperor goes back and he makes a recording. And and basically it starts out, we must endure the endurable. Now this is the first time anybody in the country had ever heard the emperor's voice. The emperor was a god. The emperor didn't talk to people. And if the emperor was coming down the street and you looked up, someone would take your head off with a sword. No one laid eyes on you. You didn't put eyes on the emperor. You didn't do that. All right. Now this is how strict that society was. And so he makes this recording. That night, these junior officers that I've talked about that were fanaticals, all right, that would assassinate anybody. Of course, they kept this real quiet because they didn't want their heads cut off. That they broke into the palace, killed several of the palace guards looking for that recording. Pretty smart. They hid it in the ladies in waiting room in their quarters. Well, no soldier's going to go into the women's room in the palace. You understand? You just didn't do that. Even they didn't do that. So they hid it in there. And the next day it played, and it was the first time, and it's a very rigid society, they did lay down their weapons. They stopped. Adami went in and he committed harikiri, ceremonial suicide, impaled himself with a sword, but usually you have a second who with a big samurai sword will take your head off so that you don't suffer. He did not have that. So he laid there and suffered for hours with that sword in him until he finally passed away. He wrote a note to the emperor, said, this is my way of apologizing to you for what has transpired in the last 4 or 5 years, my death. And so he committed suicide or harikiri. The others were all concerned that they were going to go to the gallows, all right? They didn't. The only one they hung, well, they hung several war criminals, but they hung Tojo, but they did not hang Togo. They sent him to prison, but they didn't hang him, and they shouldn't have, because he was the moderate. I'm telling you, without him pulling the strings in the background, this thing wouldn't have got done, at least not very easily. And so the next day after the recording, the Japanese flew a plane to Okinawa, and they basically hashed out the terms for the surrender. And then on September the 2nd, on board the USS Missouri, anybody know why they used the Missouri? Truman, yeah, that's very good. Truman was from Missouri. They signed the formal surrender at the end of the war. The whole thing only took about 30 minutes. Now, in the mid-'80s, I was in Kansas, and a guy I knew, a friend of mine, says, "Come here, I want you to meet somebody." And I went over there. I'll never forget this. Guy said, "My name is Bill Weibel. It rhymes with Bible." I remember to this day. He was on board that ship. He was a sailor on there. So I got to talk to him about that day. And one of the anecdotes he told me, as the Japanese were leaving, their entourage was leaving, one of the guys in the back, one of the sailors walked over there and stuck his hand out like he was going to shake his hand. And when the Japanese guy reached out, he went like that. You know how you used to do when you were kids, like that? You ever watch that movie, No Time for Sergeant, where Andy Griffith stomps on that thing, the toilet lids all fly up, and he says he's the PLO, permanent latrine orderly? He said this guy was the permanent latrine orderly. He said he cleaned toilets all the way back to the United States. He said, I never saw him again. He said if they'd been a plank, they'd probably made him walk it. He said, oh my God, he said they went nuts on him. But anyway, the Japanese delegation came on. They signed, one signed for the government, one signed for the military. All the warring parties signed. Truman or MacArthur emceed the thing. He made a few comments, closed the book, and he says, I declare these proceedings closed. That's the end of World War II. That's how the surrender took place. In the distance, circling, were literally hundreds of fighters. Hundreds. Because they were afraid of maybe a suicide attack. It never transpired. And after the Japanese left, 1,500 planes flew over the top. The guy I talked to in Kansas, Bill Weibel, told me it almost put the sun out. There were so many planes in the sky flying over. It was, like a ceremonial thing. And so after that, the battleship Missouri stayed in service through the Vietnam War, and then they mothballed it in Tacoma, Washington. In 1975, back when I was playing basketball, not watching it, we were playing in Seattle, and then we had a day off, and I think we were playing Portland State or somebody, I don't know, California. I don't know where we were going, but it doesn't make any difference. Only me. I took the ferry over to Tacoma because I wanted to see the ship. And I went on it. It was open. You could go up there, and on the deck, right here, where this is taking place, there's a medallion. And it said on this spot on September 2nd, the war ended, like that. But it was kind of underwhelming, to be honest with you. There was a couple pictures, and that was about it. I was kind of disappointed. Well, then the first Gulf War broke out. They took the Missouri out of mothballs. They sent it to Kuwait, and they put cruise missiles on it. They fired cruise missiles off that front deck. After the first Gulf War was over, they decided to mothball it again. It is an enormous ship, but it just sucked down fuel. It's 40s technology. So instead of taking it back to Tacoma, they took it to Pearl Harbor. And it is moored right next to the Arizona. So you have the beginning of the war, and you have the end of the war right next to it. Have anybody been there? You have, okay. Well, several of you have. So if you ever go, you want to do this. You go out, visit the Arizona, you'll come back on the shuttle and then drive around to Ford Island and go on. Now it's like a floating museum. They've got pictures. You can tour the ship. It's a lot different than it was in 1975. But it's a must-see if you're there. You'll go by the Oklahoma Memorial, too, while you're there. So that ship today, the Missouri, sits in Anchorage, right next to the Arizona at Pearl Harbor. And, of course, it'll be there probably forever, at least longer than we'll be around. Okay? So I guess I will end just like MacArthur did. I declare this lecture over. All right? If you have any questions, I'll be glad to try to answer for you. Yeah?
You mentioned that they estimated the million
Casualties.
Allies' deaths.
Mm-hmm. Well, casualties. Yeah.
But I've also heard they estimated that the Japanese would lose 7 million.
Yeah, that's probably, I've never, but yeah, that's probably right.
As part of that.
Yeah.
We did them a favor.
Yeah, we really did. No, we really did. You know, in 1975, the UN went back and recalculated the number of deaths at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I said 70 and 60. They came up with 100,000 at Hiroshima and 70,000 at Nagasaki. Whatever. What makes a difference, okay? You understand it was total destruction. And so in Hiroshima, has anybody been there? Okay, good for you. All right.
I just came back.
Oh, my gosh, that's awesome.
Shirt from there.
Well, you went to Hiroshima and got a shirt. You gotta love that.
Love it.
Right here's the bridge that was the aiming point. He said that building, as you see standing, was a cultural center. And the walls are like 3 or 4 feet deep. Now, everybody in there was killed, don't get me wrong. They were vaporized. But that building, and it still stands today, and that's a park. And it's the biggest tourist attraction in the country of Japan. More people go there than any place else. And in fact, I was actually looking about going there next summer. I don't know. Anyway, it's a very interesting time. This series, I'm sure you've enjoyed. It's a time that I don't think we could have today, that type of casualties with a 24-hour news cycle. You know, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, even Tarawa, Guadalcanal, and all the others. I don't know. You know, it's a different time, no question about it. But I had 2 uncles that fought in the war. And my dad was a Korean War veteran, but my uncles were World War II, and I remember talking to them. And trust me, when I said they were glad they dropped that bomb, that's an understatement, okay? Because they figured there was no way they'd live through that, you know, that invasion. And many of them wouldn't have, you know. So as he said, it probably saved many, many more lives than it ever took, because the Japanese, if, you know, we'd got to the point where we're just having to, you have to start shooting little kids. It's going to be pretty psychologically traumatizing for everybody, you know. So, yeah.
I read an article that actually the kamikaze was basically kids. I mean, they were taking 14 and 15-year-old kids. They weren't even driving cars yet, but they taught them how to fly a plane.
Just to take it off.
To be a kamikaze.
Yeah, they were so low on. In fact, they didn't even give parachutes out until the last year of the war. The Japanese didn't, because you died for the emperor. But they never used them. I've never seen a picture of a Japanese under canopy, but they never even gave them out till the last year. So yeah, they were out of pilots. If you remember at Midway, we sank the Huru, the Soru, the Kaga, and the Kega. And that was for the frontline carriers, but they lost every one of those pilots. And that was the cream of the crop. And they never really could replace them. I mean, they brought in more, but they weren't experienced like those guys were. And what was even worse than that, when we sank those 4 carriers, all the aeronautical engineers that the Japanese had were on board those carriers. They were been trained in Europe, because it's not a militarized, or not an industrial country. And so they couldn't replace them. And so at the beginning of the war, the Zero was about the best fighter there was. At the end of the war, it was the worst, because they couldn't improve on it. It still didn't even have self-sealing gas tanks at the end of the war. So it was a very useless fighter at the end. Yeah, so I don't know. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you very much. Okay.